you have to stay focused. It's so important to agree on what the single-minded message is, because that establishes everything. That establishes the whole story. Welcome to Real Creative Leadership, a place where creative leaders can find insights and practical guidance on the day-to-day job of being a creative leader. We focus on real issues, topics, and insights of creativity in the business world. Join me as we explore the best strategies for developing your team, getting others to embrace your vision, and generating amazing experiences. This webinar series is produced by the Stoke Group. I'm your host, Adam Morgan, Adobe Executive Creative Director and author of Sorry Spock, Emotions Drive Business. And this is Real Creative Leadership. Hello, welcome back to Real Creative Leadership Season 2. First of all, thank you everyone who has stuck with me and listened to all of these crazy episodes, and I appreciate you joining along here. It's nice and fun when some of you send out a note to me or an article of a certain episode that really spoke to you or gave you some good insight, and so I appreciate the feedback. That's fantastic. And as always, if there is a topic that you really care about, or that you want us to cover, or you want me to give some guidance on, please reach out. You can email me, or on realcreativeleadership.com, you can always send an email. Those usually get back to me. And then we can try and plan for that. We are going into planning mode for Season 3, so any content that you would like to see in Season 3, it would be great to hear from you. All right, today we are going to talk about the single-minded message. This is a really important topic. It's something that I have thought about for basically my whole career. In fact, let me start out with a story. So this was 1994, I believe. The first agency that I worked at was DSW, or Dallin Smith White. And before I got a job there, I had done a informational interview with one of the founders, Daryl Smith. And I remember at the time I was considering whether I should go into the creative department as a writer or designer, or if I should go into strategy. And he was the leader of all of the strategy group. And I remember he said something that was very interesting, because as we were talking about it, he said, "Adam, listen, the truth is strategy is the same thing as creativity. It's just packaged in a different way. You know, just in creative ideas, you're trying to come up with new ideas and new ways of expressing a brand." And he said, in strategy, it's the same thing, especially brand strategy. We're just trying to make a new connection in a new way. And I thought that was fascinating. I thought about that. I still do, 25, 26 years later, about the impact of creativity on strategy. And for me to explain that a little bit more, let me just break down a little bit. Before we get into the single-minded message, this is important. I want to talk about some of the basics of creativity. So especially in creative marketing or branding, really the big idea around creativity is this connection of two ideas, where you're taking, one idea, like maybe it's like whatever, something about the brand, and then some other concept that you're trying to share with it, and you're really bringing those two ideas together. I mean, that's what my whole career has been about, is bringing together two or more ideas in a new way, right? If you ever want to, Doug Hall wrote a book, Jumpstart Your Brain, and it is phenomenal. I'll probably do a whole separate episode on how to concept ideas and how to get creativity faster in your ideas. But anyhow, he talks a lot about these connection of these two ideas. So check out the book, Jumpstart Your Brain, if you want a lot of ideas on how to do this. But anyhow, that basic idea of creativity coming together. Now, here's an important part about it. It's usually best when it's two ideas coming together. It is possible to get more than two. I've seen it, but sometimes it just gets too muddy. Let me give you an example. So where I've seen it work with at least three ideas is the movie Crazy Stupid Love. It's the one with Carell, Gosling, and Stone. And if you know the storyline, there's going to be some spoilers here for anyone who hasn't seen it, but there's a relationship between Carell and Gosling in the whole dating thing. There's a relationship between Carell and Stone because it's father-daughter. And then there's a separate relationship between Gosling and Stone that's just them dating, right? And those are three separate storylines, but there's a moment in the movie when all three of those storylines collide and become one storyline. And you don't see it coming, and when it all comes together, it's a brilliant moment in that movie of where it all comes together. It's just like your brain explodes. But the thing about it is, you've spent an hour and a half with that story in order to get deep enough where those ideas come together. In marketing, it just doesn't happen that fast, right? There's an example of when I learned to do TV from Chris Drysdale back in the 90s, in the mid 90s, at my first agency. He explained that like the beauty of a TV spot is you have to summarize the whole concept down to one sentence, because otherwise people who are new to creating TV spots, they start to add in more and more and more. It's like, oh, the protagonist does this, and then this happens, and then that happens, and then later on some other person comes in and this happens. Like, it's just too complex. For like a 30-second TV spot, we had to just say, can you explain the idea in one sentence of like, guy who is bald meets someone on video dating, and she accidentally, instead of calling him Bob, calls him Bald, right? Like, it's just a simple idea. That was one of the examples that Chris did back in the 90s. So anyhow, trying to get it down to one sentence. And this is so, anyhow, in short, with creativity, when you're on the creative side, putting together two ideas is really important. More than two is really, really hard. Now let me relate that back to marketing, because that's where this strategy idea that Daryl Smith talked about comes into play. If you think about some of those true principles of marketing, like if you've ever read the book, The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing by Rees and Trout, brilliant book. But even if the basics of positioning is like, you're really saying, all right, how can I position my brand against other brands? And what's the difference? And it really comes down to like, what do you focus on? What's that single stake in the ground? What's the one thing that you care about? And that's super important when you're trying to get, a brand strategy across. So if you think about it in terms of that, when you're trying to create a brand or tell a marketing story, it's the same thing. Like, it's bringing together two ideas. First of all, you're bringing together like, what are they? And then what are you trying to say? Those are the two things you're saying. Like, if you're a brand, like everything that they believe about you in the brand, and then here's this new story or ad or experience that you're trying to express, and you're trying to take what you're saying and blend it with those pre-existing conditions of the brand, right? So it's two things come together. Or let's say it's a startup and you don't even know anything about the brand. It's still like, what do they do? Like, when you're really like, you could introduce a new brand, a new name, and people have no idea what that company does. And so what they're going to see is, what does that company do? Are they finance? Are they a retail store? What are they? And then what is the thing that you're saying about the brand, and trying to bring those two together? So it's really it's the same thing. It's bringing together two elements, whether it's a new idea with your existing brand or a new idea with a new brand, a new company, whatever it is, it's still that same idea. And in my experience, when I've tried, there's a great analogy that I've used over the years since the 90s, which is when you're trying to express an ad or a brand story or a brand experience, it's really like this idea of the bed of nails. If you have so many messages in this ad that there's like a dozen messages, it's like a bed of nails. Someone will lay on it and nothing's going to break through. They can just lay on it. Even though they're all sharp, really focused messages, there are just too many of them you can lay on it. But if you just have one nail, one message, and someone tries to lay on that, it's absolutely going to poke them in the back. It's going to hurt, right? And so this the fact of a bed of nails is a really good thing to remember. When you're creating an experience, an advertisement, anything, you need to be focused on one single idea, because that's the only thing that's going to break through. Too many, and it just doesn't make sense. I mean, think about it like if Mountain Dew were to do a commercial and it was like, or no, sorry, not Mountain Dew, but like a beverage company were to do a commercial, and instead of just focusing on Mountain Dew, they could focus on all the different fruity beverages that they had. Like, no one would remember any of them. They would just be thinking about all these random, things. It's just too much. So focus is really important. So that's what we're talking about today, is the single-minded message. And in my experience over, 2.5 decades of working, it's always been around, the way to express that is how are we translating marketing strategy into creative assets. It's that coming together of marketing strategy and creativity, and that's where we're coming up with the big ideas, right? And more often than not, that expresses itself in the form of a creative brief. The strategy people come up with the big strategy, and then when they are ready to create something, they'll build a creative brief and give it to the creative department, and then the creative department's going to take that creative brief and go build the stuff, right? And of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of creative briefs I've gotten, or downloads or kickoff meetings, whatever you want to, call it, whatever your experience is, almost always for me as a creative, during that briefing moment, the most important thing that matters is that single-minded message. Like, if I, even as a creative director later on, if I'm trying to distill it down for my team to make sure that they're on brand or on strategy, it all comes down to that single-minded message. And some people may call it different things, the main marketing message, the single-minded message, the whatever it is. It's so important that it focuses on one idea. The bed of nails, all those things, the creativity, bringing two things together, because it's always the existing stuff and then that new idea. So if in your creative brief, you don't introduce two messages because you're already dealing with all the preconceived notions that people are dealing with, right? You have to have one message and then all the existing feelings around that brand or whatever, of that product, whatever. So single-minded message is the most important thing. And let's talk about that a little bit. So why single? Why should we have that single thing? We already talked about the bed of nails. We talked about creativity. But let me just talk a little bit more about the philosophy of restraint. Because whenever I look at those creative briefs, it's really like when we're distilling it down to that single idea, it's kind of like we're backwards engineering stories. If we're saying, what is the story we're going to tell this audience? What's the message we're trying to explain? And we, so often, those stories are convoluted with so many different things. And I'll tell you, it's easy to add stuff to that single-minded message, and it's super hard to remove. So if you think about the philosophy of restraint, it's really all about how can you get the skill set of pulling back, of focusing on a single thing rather than too many things. I'll tell you honestly, of the hundreds and hundreds of creative briefs I've had and those single-minded messages, like 9 times out of 10, it's not a single-minded message. More often than not, it has 2, 3, 4, even a half dozen messages all in that single sentence or paragraph for that matter. And so the trick is, like, whenever I talk to strategists, I talk to them about like it's that skill set, that ability to have restraint and to focus in on a single idea is really, really hard. Most people can't do it. Most people, they'll listen to stakeholders or they're too scared and they'll be like, oh, there's so many things we got to talk about. We can't just talk about one. And so they'll throw in a dozen ideas, right? But that is a skill set that you need. If you can learn to simplify, if you can learn to have focus on your story and your message down to a single idea, you have yourself a career. Absolutely. Because most people can't do it. It's really, really hard. And so just remember that. It's easy to add stuff in, but it's hard to remove it from those single-minded messages. So if you can really get it down to one idea, you're golden. And I'm going to go through a bunch of examples here in a minute to really explain what I mean by focusing it down to a single idea, because I think it's hard. So anyhow, that's the most important thing, single-minded message. And now there are 2 things that I want to give you deep examples on in how you do it, because there's more to just, the single-minded message is it's like the keystone of your story. But there are more elements. I know, like, it's unrealistic for me to think that, okay, the only thing we're going to say in an ad or the only thing we're going to say on a website or an experience is one thing. But the single-minded message is the gateway. It's the entry point. There can be other parts of the story, but it can't be like everything can't be the same importance. You have to create a hierarchy. And so the 2 things we're going to talk about hierarchy of messages and then the single-minded message, good and bad examples and how you do it. So let's start with the hierarchy of message. What I'm going to do is I'm going to break away here and show you some examples of messaging documents. These are older documents, so they're not relevant right now, but at least it'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about of if you're trying to tell a story. Because when you really break down a story, right, there's the story arc, which is what's the big story that we're trying to tell. And then there are steps and moments of this story, like the hero's journey or whatever, format or framework you use. So it's important to think like the single-minded message is really like explaining that story arc. What if there's one takeaway, if there's one story we remember from this experience, what is it? And then we can break down chapters of that story and say, okay, if the story is X, first we do this, then we do that, and then we do that. And that's really, to me, that's the story message or the story arc and a story kit that I usually put together when I'm crafting messaging documents or experiences. And we'll get more into that in a minute. But let's talk about that hierarchy of messages. So let's break away here, and I'm going to show you an example of this is an old message. This is just one page of a messaging doc that I got on financial services. And if you look at it, you can tell like there's a lot of information here. Like in classic messaging format, we're going to have like background and more context and what are we trying to do and what are some of the problems that customers are having, who's our audience, what are they trying to solve, and what are some other challenges and opportunities and situations. So this is just a page from that. You can see over on the left, you've got the situation, you've got some context at the top, and you've got challenges and opportunities here. Now, normally as a creative, I get a document like this that has all of this great context. And they'll call it a brief, and they'll give it to me and say, okay, great, here's the brief, go off and make something. But I just want to focus in here a little bit and just show you, like, even within this document, there are so many stories that I could tell. I mean, there are probably, 100 stories I could tell. And I'm just going to highlight a few. Like, here they are, our audience is being pulled in a million directions, or historically things are just informational, or digital engagement is about necessity, or you're not having to deal with legacy systems. Millennials have heightened a distrust towards financial institutions. Like, there's so many stories. And imagine if I were to say, like, what is the big story out of this financial thing? I could have picked among any of these 6 or 7 kind of single-minded messages and told that story. And usually when we're creating experiences, there's often a conflict between the creative department and the strategy department. And it often comes down to this. Like, I would say 95% of the battles that I've had over the years have been on the focus of messaging. And so, for example, I as a creative will take this brief and I'll go off and say, okay, there's a dozen messages here. The main story I'm going to talk about is, all right, digital engagement is an absolute necessity. So digital first. I've got to talk about digital first. That's it. That's the story. And I'll build that as the story arc. And then all the little sub messages are building off of that. But that's the main story I'm telling, right? And then here's the problem: is I go back and I'll share with stakeholders or partners or clients, and I'll say, okay, we've built the story. Here it is. And they'll look at it and they'll say, what are you an idiot? Like, of course that's not the story. It was clearly in the brief. The story is this, right? Something else. And I'm just completely lost and thinking, yeah, that was in there, but all of those things were in there, and I just had to choose, right? So I chose something. And that right there is the core of the battle around messaging between the creatives and the strategists. So this is why it's so important to have a hierarchy of message. If in this whole thing of ideas and messages, it's great to have all of them in there for context, but there really needs to be an agreement on what is the main story. And that's where the single-minded message comes in. That's where you put it at the top and you say, okay, here's all this background, all these challenges, opportunities, but the main story we want to talk about is this: millennials don't trust financial institutions. That's the story. And if we agree on that, if in the brief we have that single-minded message, that's the single thing we want to talk about, whatever it may be. I'm not saying that was in this example, but you've got to focus on what that single story is so we know what the whole experience is going to be about. Because when creatives go off and they're wanting to come up with a whole bunch of concepts, right? Visual concepts, headline-driven concepts, whatever those ideas are, they're going to take that single-minded message and they're going to just put that with different creative ideas or different elements of the story, or even what expectations are of the brand, and they're going to make those connections. So you have to stay focused. It's so, so important to agree on what the single-minded message is, because that establishes everything. That establishes the whole story. And then next, after you establish that single-minded message, then you have to put everything else in a hierarchy of message. So if I look again at that example, and if we had had a really good doc, we would have said, here's the main story, and here's the next most important message, and then the next most, and the next most. And it is really, really hard. But if you can push back on your strategy people, or if you're a strategist, make sure you put it in a hierarchy. What's the most important thing? They can't all be number one. Most important story, then the next most important message, third, fourth, fifth. And the reason why that's important is, now let's say that creative goes off and they're going to create an email, and we're going to create a landing page, and we're going to create some banner ads, and we're going to create whatever around this story that we're trying to get out to an audience. That number one story, that's going to be the concept, the single-minded message. And it may be the headline, or maybe the main visual. And then all those other elements, maybe we'll get like number 2 and 3 in an email body copy. And number 4 is the call to action, right? If we're lucky. And in a landing page, because again, you can't just have too many messages, the bed of nails that won't go through. That main thing is going to be in the landing page, and then maybe we'll have some supporting elements. But there has to be a hierarchy. It's got to be a first, second, third. It can't just be all 3 of these things are number 1, because we'll pick one and it'll be the wrong one. So that's the hierarchy of messages. And there's something interesting. I actually years ago created a creative brief, because if you've ever created creative briefs, it's always like, we've got the marketing objective, we've got background, we've got all the messaging pillars, even like strategy documents. It's always like there's always several pillars, right? But pillars, when you look at them, they're all equal, and that's tricky. So I say you have to take all that context, all that background, everything, and put it in a hierarchy. And so at one point, with some of my stakeholders, I created a creative brief that just said, here's the main message, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever, and that's it. And you have to put in each of those sections one idea. And we're going to get back to like how you craft a single-minded message, but you can't have the ands. No ands. Just one idea. And then as creatives, we can go back and we can craft stories and experiences around that super easy because we know what's most important all the way down. So that's one way of doing it, is just focus your creative brief with the hierarchy of message. That's critical. You could even go more simple than that. Like there's a story, and this may be true or not, I don't know, but I've heard it over the years that there was one agency that all they did for their creative brief is they focused it on, it didn't have all the stuff in there. It just had one thing, and it was, what's the emotion we're trying to get? And so that was the whole thing with the messages. I think it was Mother in London that I heard from the stories. I'm not sure. If someone knows, please let me know. But anyhow, there's an interesting idea around that. It's like, if you really want someone to react, what's the emotion that you want them to feel, or what's the message you want them to feel? And that's it. Like, just focus it on that. And then for me, I feel like then it's the hierarchy. But those are super effective briefs. If you get beyond it, it's again, go back to that example where there's all those things and we can tell a million different stories and we probably won't tell the right one. Or the concept, because of creativity, just the basics of creativity, we can't get 4 or 5 or 6 messages in there. The bed of nails thing, it falls apart. Well, now I want to give you some examples, some good and bad examples of a single-minded message. So these are just some examples that I've written up based on, past, brands or experiences, and I've generalized them so that it's not a specific brand or a specific product. But at least you can get these were real, actual single-minded messages that I have received over the years in creative briefs. So here's this first one. We provide your organization with creative velocity to design and publish exceptional content in order to accelerate your business. Your teams must create highlight data, blah, blah, blah. And it all is, in a more streamlined way. Like that was for a mobile app product that, oh my word, it was so complex. Like that was this key message that I got, the single-minded message. And you can tell it's like a paragraph, right? There are the half a dozen to a dozen different stories I could tell out of that one. And here was another one from that same product at a different time. We empower line of business owners and marketers to manage, produce, and deliver beautiful, engaging mobile apps that have the power to transform business, giving control over the life cycle. Look at that. There's like 5 different ideas. Managing is one, producing, delivering is one, engaging apps, beautiful, that have the power to transform business. That's another one. Beautiful is another one. Control over the life cycle. There's another message. Like that's a half a dozen messages. Even though it's one sentence, it's a half a dozen messages. And that's where I always say, like, if you really want to know if you've got a single-minded message, it can just have like one idea. But a good clue is if I see "and" in there, this and that, or a lot of commas, like there's a serial comma issue going on here, then there's clearly a laundry list of stuff in there. So it's not a single-minded message. You're trying to fit them all in because you're like, oh, this is important, so is that, and you're trying to mash them all in there, and you need to stop. Again, learn how to remove, not add. Philosophy of restraint. So here's one more good example, or bad example. And this one's hilarious. Like this one I got, if you notice, it had like one and then subsection 1.1, subsection 1.13, and subsection 1.13.1. And it was all about this data thing. That's so much stuff. Like that's not a key message. That was literally in the brief in the key message section for me with all these subsections. So clearly not single-minded. Now let me give you some examples of good single-minded key messages. All right, here's this first one. This was for an event. I need to register now to save with advanced pricing. Like that's the story, save on advanced pricing. Great. I can create all sorts of content and stories around that. The next one, this was after we worked with that strategist above, this is where we landed on that mobile app thing. It said, our tool helps you create beautiful mobile experiences. That was it. Like all of that other stuff of delivery and this and creation, we narrowed it down to just create beautiful experiences. That's it. Beautiful mobile experiences. Single idea. And here's another one. It was just like a different industry one. So for travel and hospitality, we help you create experiences that are timeless. That was another one that we did a while back. But that was super clear, like timeless experiences. Everything on that whole campaign was focused on timeless experiences. And there's a lot of depth to it, and we certainly got into more elements of it with that campaign, but it was focusing on that single-minded message. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Single-minded message needs to be single, bed of nails. You can't add ands or commas or other things and add more junk in there. Really focus on making it streamlined and simple. And again, when you think back, if you're taking it from there beyond a creative brief, if you're creating a messaging document, make sure in your messaging document, like I said, I used to create a lot of these story kits, is what I call them, because it would bring together the whole story, art and words and messaging all into one kit. And the most important part was find out what the story arc is. That's your single-minded message. What's the big story we're trying to tell? One story. And then as you need more stuff underneath it, you can have the chapters in that story underneath it. So no longer just saying, here are my 3 or 4 messaging pillars. No, those are chapters. What's the first chapter, the second chapter, and the third chapter? And I can create a whole experience on like just one chapter or one pillar, right? If it's a deeper experience. But if I'm trying to look at the whole structure, what's the story? What are the different chapters? How do they all fit together and create an actual journey and flow of telling that story? Because just like, a good movie, a good story, a good everything, you have to have that flow. We can always zero in on things as we need to. And if you want an email just on chapter 3, subsection 2, great, we'll do that. And that will be the one single-minded message. But in general of messaging across this whole entire product or brand or whatever it is, what's the story arc? What are you trying to say? And then break it into chapters. Anyhow, hopefully that's helpful. That's just, me blabbing on about, how I've tried to focus it in my experience over my career. And it really comes down to the value of focused experiences. Because if you have too many of them, it's just going to be scattered and you'll stand for nothing. So what is that single stake in the ground that you stand for? What is that focus? What is that laser focus of what you are trying to say to your audience? And just pick that one thing and try and highlight on it. Anyhow, in my opinion, that's where all the value comes. Like you can have multiple experiences, but you focus your experiences and then you connect them all. That's how you create a great brand experience for a customer. So thanks for listening for this episode of Real Creative Leadership on the single-minded message. And again, this story isn't just for creative people, but it's for strategists, brand builders, business owners, leaders, whatever. It's super helpful for all of us to really understand in telling messages for a brand or for a company to really focus on that single-minded message. Well, thanks for listening in. As always, you can find us on realcreativeleadership.com or across all of your favorite podcast platforms or on YouTube or wherever you want to find us. We appreciate you joining. Again, as always, the final ask is if you enjoyed this, please like it, forward it to someone, give it a thumbs up, whatever it is, whatever platform you're on. We appreciate it. As always, I'm open to feedback. If you have any, please let me know. We'll address that in future sessions and try and take care of all of your creative leadership needs. Again, you can also find me at Adam W. Morgan. And as always, this whole series is produced by the Stoke Group. You can find them at thestokegroup.com. If you need help producing your own show, your own creative, your own brand experience, they can help you out. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye. Thanks for listening to Real Creative Leadership. I'm your host, Adam Morgan, and this series was brought to you by the Stoke Group. For the most effective marketing, use both sides of your brain to align your strategy, creative execution, and analysis. Connect with the Stoke Group for help designing each step of your marketing plan and creating a coherent vision. Visit thestokegroup.com to learn more.